Hey guys, tonight we journey into a world of hushed prayers and forbidden passions. You're standing barefoot on cold stone outside a high-walled convent. The moonlight slips over ivy-choked gates as a bell tolls softly from within. You push open a weathered wooden door, curiously unlocked, and step into a courtyard that smells faintly of lavender and candle wax. Inside, a choir of women sing their nighttime hymns with haunting grace. But behind that sacred harmony, something else stirs laughter, muffled whispers, and the faintest creak of a door that shouldn't be opening. You're about to discover that celibacy, like medieval plumbing, was more of a suggestion than a reliable system. And in this quiet nunnery, you're not alone. Someone else is here. A priest, maybe, or a local noblewoman on a secret visit, or could that shadow belong to another nun? Either way, you probably won't survive this century without serious emotional confusion. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I'd love to know where and when you're listening. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step further into the cloister and quickly learn not all vows are kept and not all sins are silent. 1,000 years ago, convents were meant to be sanctuaries. Women who joined them were supposed to live lives of chastity, prayer, and discipline. But well, human nature tends to laugh in the face of strict rules, especially when those rules are written by men in faraway cities and enforced by tired abbesses juggling 37 other problems. You move down a corridor lit by flickering oil lamps, your footsteps muffled by thick tapestries. And here it is, a nun's cell. Inside you spot a crude wooden bed, a rosary on the wall, and beneath the bed, a hidden bundle of letters. Love letters written in clumsy Latin. Some of them are from local men. Others, more shockingly, are from women in other convents. One even includes a lock of hair wrapped in a silk ribbon. And this wasn't rare. Historian whispers echo through time about Sister Benedetta in 17th century Italy, who claimed to receive divine visions. But those visions oddly centered on her passionate and very physical love for another nun named Bartolomea. Were these visions genuine or just a holy excuse for late-night rendezvous? Historians still argue whether Benedetta was manipulated, mentally ill, or simply in love in the wrong century. You pause as distant footsteps echo, then duck into a storage closet full of candles and sacramental wine. It's hard not to smirk. You've read the records. Many convents had shockingly high pregnancy rates. One 14th century report dryly observed that the miraculous conception excuse was growing a bit too popular. Why? Well, remember, many girls were forced into nunneries not by piety, but by politics. Too many daughters marry one off and send the others to God. It was cheaper after all, but not all of them wanted to stay. Some ran away. Others got creative. You pass a small herb garden and glimpse a nun clipping leaves under moonlight. She's harvesting pennyroyal, a plant used for centuries to regulate menstruation, and in large doses something stronger. Your stomach knots. She's doing this in secret. The church forbade such uses. But who's watching? A curious moment in some convents, especially wealthy ones. Nuns had access to books that even priests couldn't get. Medical texts, astrology charts, even poetry about love and sex. Literacy was power and knowledge led to questions. Why is pleasure sinful? Why is touch forbidden? Back in the hall, you hear muffled giggling. You follow it, naughty, I know, and come upon a wooden screen separating two cells. Through a crack, you see silhouettes pressed together. It's fast fumbling and silent, but clearly not prayer. In fact, many medieval writers warned about this. Women together breed the devil's fire, one monk warned in his journals. Calm down, Geoffrey, and let's not forget the outside world. Some convents were placed next to monasteries with adjoining tunnels. Yes, you heard that right. Archaeologists have found more than a few suspicious underground passages between male and female religious houses. Officially, they were for shared chapels and resource transfer. You think back to those love letters and wonder what kind of resources were being transferred. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In 12th century Germany, the Hildegard of Bingen, an actual canonized saint, wrote extensively about the emotional bonds between women in cloisters. While Hildegard herself is considered devout, her letters often carried an intensity that scholars still debate. Meanwhile, a quirky tidbit: one convent in France trained its nuns in falconry. Picture that: holy women strapping on leather gloves and whistling for birds of prey. Apparently, chastity doesn't mean boring. As you exit the convent courtyard, the smell of frankincense still clings to your hair. You feel the tension of a place trying to balance devotion with desire. A place where rules are rigid but people, well, not so much. You glance back once before the heavy door closes behind you. Somewhere a bell tolls for midnight prayers. Or is it a signal for something else? You've barely dusted off the incense from your cloak when you arrive at your next stop, a silent stone-walled monastery just before dawn. A rooster crows somewhere far off, and the air smells of dew parchment and something suspiciously like wine. Inside, rows of monks kneel in prayer. Their hoods cast shadows over solemn faces. But as you slip behind a pillar and listen more closely, you can't help but notice a few are snoring. And one is definitely sneaking glances at the abbot's very stern niece who has just brought in the morning bread. Yes, welcome to the realm of the supposedly celibate, where vows of chastity are written in ink, but broken in flesh. You trail behind the novices as they shuffle into the refectory for breakfast. It's all very austere. Porridge, silence, prayer before each bite. But beneath that surface stillness, something itches. Because it turns out monks, like their nun counterparts, were often just as human as the rest of us. Take, for instance, Brother Eberhard of 13th century Bavaria. He was caught not once, not twice, but 6 times with different women, usually in the laundry room. Apparently, suds were an aphrodisiac. He was finally relocated to a more isolated monastery. Whether that worked is unclear. Historians still argue whether frequent transfers were punishment or just cover-ups. You step into the scriptorium, where scribes bend over manuscripts. One monk glances up and hastily hides a small vellum scrap, curious. If you peek, you'll find a doodle of a woman lifting her skirts next to a very shocked-looking saint. Medieval monks loved their marginalia playful, inappropriate, and sometimes anatomically baffling. And here's the catch. Not all clergy actually took their vows seriously. Some entered religious life simply because it offered education, meals, and a roof over their heads. Love, sex, and temptation. Those were just part of the background noise, like bad lute music or the constant argument over who stole the last hunk of cheese. By the 12th century, church leaders realized this was becoming a bit of a problem. Reforms were issued. Rules were tightened. Monks were told to avoid contact with women entirely, including their own mothers. You'd think that would help. It didn't. In fact, some monasteries became hotbeds of whispered scandal. One report from an English abbey complained that half the brethren are either drunk in love or in the habit of sneaking out after dark. You wonder what kind of confessions they had to make. You step through the cloisters and find the garden where a young monk is tending herbs. He looks innocent enough, but he's growing something unusual mandrake. It was believed to scream when uprooted and had strong ties to fertility magic. In some recipes, it was soaked in milk and slipped into someone's drink to induce lust or visions, or both, depending on the dosage. Then there's the abbot's wine. Contrary to modern belief, monks weren't exactly teetotalers. Many made and consumed large amounts of alcohol. It wasn't just safe, it was holy. But as you take a cautious sip of the blessed vintage, you detect a fruity note, and is that cinnamon-spiced wine was often used in aphrodisiacs. Coincidence, maybe, but someone's giggling in the cellar. Here's a mainstream historical fact, the Benedictine rule. The foundational guide for monastic life includes strict prohibitions on lust and urges celibacy. However, by the 14th century, many monasteries had become notorious for ignoring these restrictions, especially wealthier ones with less oversight. And your quirky tidbit: a 15th century monk in Italy invented a board game to help focus the mind away from temptations of the flesh. It worked exactly like modern snakes and ladders, but with moral lessons. If you landed on lust, you slid back to square one. The game was banned after 3 weeks when players started cheering for sin squares. As you pass by the chapel, you hear singing again. But this time, there's a strain of melancholy beneath the harmony. Because not all monks failed in their vows. Some struggled desperately to keep them. The letters they left behind speak of painful longing, sleepless nights, and furious prayers begging for desire to be taken away. And there were punishments. Oh yes. If caught, monks could be whipped, starved, exiled, or in extreme cases bricked into walls. You glance uneasily at the cracked mortar near the crypt. Is that just a trick of the light? Historians still debate how widespread these punishments truly were, whether they were rare and symbolic or far more routine than records suggest. Either way, the fear was real. As you make your way back toward the entrance, the sky lightens and birds begin to sing. The monastery looks peaceful again. But you now know better. Beneath the hymns and habits lies a tangled web of devotion, denial, and desire. Just before you leave, a monk steps beside you and murmurs, "Brother Thomas sends his regards and asks if you brought more ink." Strange. You don't have any ink, and you're not Brother Thomas. But you nod anyway and slip away before anyone else starts asking questions. You've barely escaped the monastery's suspicious glances when you stumble into something far stranger, a town square ringed with onlookers. In the center stands a young woman, pale with fear, her hair wild under a coarse linen veil. Around her, a group of officials prepare what looks like a ritual. Salt, iron keys, a bowl of water. You're not in a church anymore. You're at a virginity trial, and this is about to get deeply uncomfortable. Let's make one thing clear. Medieval folks had an obsession with purity that would make modern health influencers look chill. Virginity wasn't just prized, it was weaponized, especially for women. But how do you prove something so invisible? That's where things get weird. First, there's the classic, the two-finger test. A midwife or matron would insert fingers to assess the presence of a hymen because apparently no one told them that hymens are about as reliable as medieval maps of dragons. Historians still argue whether these tests were ever truly medical or just tools of public shame and control. You inch closer and notice something even stranger. One of the men, probably the town scribe, is holding a cabbage leaf. No joke. Some medieval communities believed placing a cabbage leaf under a woman's pillow would turn black if she were impure. Science not exactly, but it felt convincing to the crowd. Another test, salt. The accused might be made to lick a chunk of it or even sit on it to see if she sweated because pure girls supposedly wouldn't. Yes. Salt-based purity detection. Suddenly you're grateful for modern, awkward doctor visits. And don't even get started on the urine test. A woman would urinate onto barley or wheat seeds over several days. If the seeds sprouted quickly, she was pregnant, or depending on the context, not a virgin. How this logic worked, that's still unclear. But hey, at least it's compostable. You skirt around the square to the shade of a tavern awning. An old man mutters beside you. When I was a boy, they used nettle stings instead. You glance over. He grins toothlessly. That's not comforting. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In certain regions, especially under canon law, virginity was legally tied to a woman's marriageability and dowry value. If a husband accused his bride of not being a virgin, her entire family could lose the dowry and social status. In other words, it wasn't just personal, it was economic warfare. And the quirky tidbit, one 13th century French village recorded a case where a girl proved her innocence by pulling a thorn from her tongue without flinching. Apparently, the thinking was, if you can do that calmly, you're morally clean. Or just really good at ignoring pain. But what happens if you fail the trial? Public penance, mostly wearing a sackcloth fasting, or being paraded through the village. In more brutal cases, the accused might be locked in a cage hung over water, or forced to beg at church steps until forgiven. Notably, most of these tests and punishments were reserved for women. Men's purity, not really a concern. You shift awkwardly as the young woman in the square stares straight ahead. The midwife has dipped a cloth into the water bowl. Everyone leans forward. Then, surprised, she declares the girl pure. The crowd lets out a murmur of approval and disperses, already hungry for gossip about someone else. But here's the twist. Later that evening, by firelight, you overhear a conversation behind a tavern. It's the midwife. She's speaking to a well-dressed older woman. She passed, the midwife says softly, because I said she did. She paid. Turns out even medieval morality had a price tag. Still, there were others, especially noble families, who staged these trials as public theater. Imagine this, a royal wedding night, sheets displayed to the crowd the next morning, stained with blood as proof. Of what virginity loyalty? It's hard to say. Some nobles kept ceremonial deflowering cloths like trophies. Others used pig's blood. Historians still debate how often these trials were actual procedures versus symbolic rituals to reinforce patriarchal control. Was anyone truly testing or just pretending to? You pause at the edge of a small chapel. Inside is a statue of the Virgin Mary, eyes serene, robes flowing. Beneath her feet is a tiny box carved with lilies. The inscription reads, Puritas est fortitudo. Purity is strength. You can't help but wonder if it ever felt like that to the women being tested. The bells toll for evening prayers. You pull your cloak tighter and walk on past empty stalls and shuttered windows. You're beginning to realize that medieval life didn't draw clean lines between the sacred and the absurd, especially not when it came to the body. And in a world where one bad accusation could ruin a life, sometimes the strangest trials were better than the alternative. You leave behind the town square and its trial by cabbage leaf following a winding pilgrimage road that snakes past crumbling shrines and roadside inns. Dust clings to your boots and the scent of candle wax grows stronger with every step. Up ahead, a cluster of travelers kneel before a gleaming relic housed in a golden box, lit by flickering lamps and guarded by a wide-eyed friar. But something feels off. Because these people, they aren't just praying. They're weeping, trembling, and in more than a few cases visibly aroused. Welcome to the strange intersection of sainthood and sex, where spiritual longing occasionally takes a very physical detour. You edge closer. The relic inside the case is said to be the femur of Saint Agnes, a virgin martyr. But one woman, face-flushed, lips parted, is whispering to it like a lover. Another man holds a small pouch to his chest, tears in his eyes, mumbling something that sounds suspiciously like a proposal. Weird, yes, but not unheard of. Medieval people believed relics had power. Real, tangible power. They could heal wounds, cure infertility, and if you played your cards right, bless your sex life. Pilgrims brought offerings not just of gold or incense, but of other things. Locks of hair, fertility charms, even wax models of body parts including, genitals. Mainstream historical fact. The Church officially sanctioned relic veneration and collected them with fervor. Entire towns competed to claim the skull of a saint or a drop of holy blood. Pilgrimage routes boomed with business, and some churches grew wealthy beyond reason. But here's the fringe detail. Some women claimed to have romantic relationships with saints. One nun, Marjorie Kempe, famously described spiritual ecstasy so intense it sounds suspiciously like a full-body climax. Historians still argue whether these experiences were divine rapture or deeply repressed desire slipping out sideways. And then there were the holy dildos. Yes, you heard that right. Some miracle shrines were rumored to house wax objects shaped like phalluses left behind by women praying for fertility or sexual satisfaction. In one notorious case, women reportedly borrowed them for a few nights before returning them cleaned and rededicated. Church authorities destroyed most records, but a few very embarrassed chroniclers wrote down just enough to tantalize future historians. You continue down the road to a more remote shrine. This one's smaller, less polished, and stranger. Inside, an effigy of Saint Wilgefortis hangs on the cross, complete with a long beard and a dress. She was said to be a woman who prayed to avoid an unwanted marriage and miraculously grew facial hair to repel suitors. The result? A cult of followers, especially women who saw her as a patron of bodily autonomy. Some even rubbed soil from beneath her statue onto their bellies while trying to conceive or not to. People weren't always sure what the miracle should be. And here's your quirky tidbit. In southern Italy, pilgrims would sleep next to relics overnight in hopes of receiving dreams that would guide their love life. These holy sleepovers became so common that certain chapels had to issue rules no touching the bones after midnight. You settle onto a bench and watch as a young man lays out a carved ivory statue, probably Saint Sebastian bare-chested and pierced by arrows. But the way he strokes the figure's face suggests something deeper than reverence. You raise an eyebrow. Sebastian has long been an icon for both devotion and desire his soft features and bound pose igniting inspiration for centuries of artists, and not all of them strictly religious. The friar glances over at you. Careful, he says with a wink. Some saints are too generous with their miracles. You nod solemnly, as if this makes complete sense. Historians still debate whether erotic relic veneration was widespread practice, or a collection of fringe cases blown out of proportion. But the lines between desire, desperation, and devotion were never neat. In a time when open sexuality was often suppressed, the sacred provided a strange loophole. You step back into the sun, blinking. Another group of pilgrims is arriving carrying a banner that reads, Saint Martha Breaker of Serpent Lusts. One woman clutches a locket, another a long braid of hair. They sing a hymn soft and oddly sensual. And as the road leads you toward your next stop, you realize something in medieval times: the divine and the carnal weren't always opposites. Sometimes they were co-conspirators. The sun dips low as you enter a bustling medieval city, its streets choked with carts cursing vendors, and the occasional pig trotting where no pig should be. But your eyes aren't on the cobblestones, they're locked on the dazzling chaos of clothing colors and textures flashing past. Velvets, silks, leather belts with very suspicious clasps. You're here to unravel one of the strangest medieval obsessions of all: the link between what people wore and what they did in bed. Yes, it's time to talk about sumptuary laws, those delightfully unhinged rules that told people exactly what to wear based on their social status, income, and, believe it or not, sexual behavior. You pass a noblewoman in crimson velvet. According to the local law, only women of noble birth and unblemished virtue could wear that shade. One tear in her reputation, or her hemline, and she'd be fined, stripped of titles and clothing, or publicly shamed. Mainstream historical fact. Throughout Europe, especially in places like England, Italy, and France, sumptuary laws tried to control excess and reinforce class divisions. These laws dictated everything from sleeve width to shoe length. And yes, shoe length. Those ridiculously pointy poulaines you've seen in manuscripts, they could only be worn by the upper crust, and were often coded as sexual markers. But here's where things get weird. You round a corner and spot a tailor shop. A sign reads, "Belts for Virtue or Vice." A local legend swirls that certain belt styles, tight leather with bronze studs, signaled that a woman was available for hire, even if she wasn't technically a prostitute. Others claimed that a red lining in a man's cloak meant he'd recently confessed to adultery and paid a fine to be let off lightly. Think of it as a medieval walk of shame, but fashion-forward. You peer into a shop where bolts of fabric are unfurled, green, deep blue, and the ever-controversial yellow. In several regions, prostitutes were legally required to wear yellow or striped garments to signal their profession. A practical idea, but it got messy fast. Because guess what? Yellow became trendy. Suddenly, noble women wanted it. And poor women wore it just to fake confidence. Authorities panicked. New laws were passed to refine the dress code for prostitutes even further. Some cities mandated bells, others forced them to wear specific hats. One town in France even required open sleeves to the elbow to ensure they couldn't hide their sins. Still, historians argue whether these laws were consistently enforced or mostly symbolic scare tactics. It's one thing to say no scarlet shoes unless you're married and over 30, but quite another to run around inspecting shoelaces like a medieval fashion cop. You enter a tavern and find a heated argument about a local scandal. A merchant's daughter wore silk slippers to a feast, slippers meant only for women who'd borne 2 children within wedlock. Shocked gasps all around. The punishment. Her mother had to walk barefoot to church holding a candle. Classic medieval logic, you broke the rules, but your mom suffers. Sounds about right. Now here's your quirky tidbit. In Venice, a man once sued a woman for fraudulent display she had worn an expensive pearl necklace to a ball which led him to assume she was noble. He proposed. She accepted. Only later did he find out the necklace was borrowed, and she was the daughter of a butcher. He demanded compensation for deception and erotic misdirection. The court actually ruled in her favor. Fashion wins. And it wasn't just clothes. Jewelry, perfumes, even certain hairstyles were seen as coded language. A woman who wore her hair uncovered might be signaling flirtation. A man with too much embroidery. Definitely suspicious. Monks were known to secretly write sermons about lacework being the devil's net. You sip ale while watching a couple flirt across the room. She touches her brooch, a silver circle with red glass, and he adjusts his collar. A quiet conversation in accessories. You can't quite decode it, but you know something's being said. One law in London even restricted the length of women's veils, arguing that longer veils were invitations to vanity and unnatural lust. Unnatural lust from a veil that's impressive. Still, the logic wasn't always prudish. Some authorities feared that when commoners dressed like nobles, it blurred the social lines that kept people in their place. If everyone could wear crimson and gold, how could you tell who was virtuous and who wasn't? Or more importantly, who you were legally allowed to flirt with? And therein lies the real heart of the issue. These laws weren't just about modesty, they were about control. Control of bodies, control of desire, control of status. And when people pushed back by wearing forbidden colors, flaunting illegal fabrics, or sewing hidden messages into hems, it wasn't just rebellion. It was seduction as resistance. As you walk back out into the dusk, the city lights begin to glow. You pass a woman in soft gray linen, unassuming, except for a scarlet ribbon tied around her ankle. A subtle signal, or maybe just fashion. You'll never know for sure. But in medieval times, your clothes didn't just make the man or the woman. They told the world who you loved, how you sinned, and whether the sin was worth the fine. You awaken to the soft rustle of reeds beneath your feet. Morning mist clings low over the marshy field, and somewhere nearby a rooster screams like it's auditioning for a horror play. But you're not here for livestock. You're here for something far more elusive and far more awkward, because today you're attending a witch trial, and the charge isn't potion brewing or dancing naked in moonlight. It's seed theft. Yes, you heard that right. In the tangled logic of the medieval mind, witches weren't just accused of cursing cows and spoiling crops. They were believed to steal men's semen, often in their sleep. How through magic dreams or somehow flying demon lovers with collecting bowls. If that sentence made you squint, congratulations, you're thinking like a modern person. You follow a crowd toward a wooden platform where a woman in tattered blue stands trembling. Her neighbors whisper that her ex-lover now wakes up drained, and sheep in her field are mysteriously refusing to breed. Naturally, it must be sorcery. The bishop raises a hand. He begins a sermon about unnatural extraction and wanton collection. You suppress a cough. There's something deeply surreal about hearing a holy man give a lecture on magical nocturnal emissions while a rooster poops on his boot. Mainstream historical fact: during the late Middle Ages, and especially into the 15th century, witch trials began to incorporate more sexually charged accusations. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum described witches using magic to steal male virility or trap semen for nefarious ends, including summoning demons or creating monstrous children. Yes, medieval horror had range. But here's your fringe tidbit. Some accused witches claimed their familiars' tiny demons or spirits in the form of animals sucked bodily fluids from them at night. The Church interpreted this as both physical and sexual. One poor woman in 1485 described a small toad with human hands that tickled her while she slept. You know, totally normal. You step closer to the accused woman. Her name is Ilsa, and she once worked as a midwife, already a red flag. Midwives were often the first to be suspected of magical interference, especially when babies were born dead or suspiciously alive after questionable conceptions. The crowd murmurs as the inquisitor lifts a jar filled with cloudy liquid. "We found this under her bed," he proclaims. "You hope it's broth. It is probably not broth." Historians still argue whether trials like this were about genuine belief in magic or more about controlling women, especially women who were sexually independent, single, or simply inconvenient. Ilsa had turned down 2 marriage proposals, helped 3 women with unexplained pregnancies, and supposedly read from an old herbal manuscript. That's enough to qualify as a sex sorceress in this village. You overhear a man whispering that she summoned an incubus. According to folklore, incubi were male demons who seduced women in dreams, often described with cold skin and eyes like smoke. Their female counterparts, succubi, visited men and were blamed for everything from impotence to chronic laziness, because of course they were. The Inquisitor now questions Ilsa, asking if she's ever ridden a demon's staff. She blinks. The silence is suffocating. Then, in the most medieval act of defiance imaginable, she laughs. Hard. It's a bold move. But laughter is dangerous. Women who laughed, talked too much, or had knowledge of herbs were frequently branded as witches. The belief was that sex and magic were inseparable, that women who embraced their bodies must surely be consorting with devils. You look down at the Inquisitor's notes. Doodles of circles, moons, and a rough sketch of, is that a man being chased by a goat? These were the minds shaping policy. The trial ends in uncertainty. No one can prove what the jar contains. No one saw her with a demon. But she's exiled anyway, sent to a remote convent to reflect. You doubt she'll be reflecting. She'll be quietly helping more women with fewer eyes watching. On your way back through the village, a boy points you toward a tree where young men tie ribbons to protect their seed from theft. The idea is this: if your seed is claimed by a woman in the waking world, she can't steal it magically. You stare at the tree. It is very full. And here's your quirky detail to wrap it all up. In one region of Bavaria, men would sleep with a knife under their pillow, not to fend off burglars, but to cut any invisible thread witches might use to drain their vitality. One man even tied sausages to his ankles for protection. You can imagine the jokes that inspired. The mist thickens as you walk on the fields, still damp and shimmering. Somewhere behind you, a woman in exile quietly hums a lullaby. Magic or not, she still knows the power of rhythm breath and the human body. And as the world fades into dusk again, you realize the true fear wasn't witches stealing seed. It was women holding power, sexual, medical, emotional, in a world that didn't know what to do with them. The next path you take leads not to a village, not to a court or convent, but to a peculiar little garden hidden behind the crumbling wall of a half-abandoned abbey. There are no monks here, no prayers echoing in Latin, just birdsong and something else. You pause. Are those fruit? You step closer. Oh, they are not fruit. They are penises, dozens of them, dangling like pears from a tree. Welcome to the utterly bizarre world of medieval penis trees. A recurring, weirdly earnest, and uncomfortably enthusiastic image in the marginalia and visual culture of the late Middle Ages. And no, this isn't metaphorical. We're talking about actual depictions of trees whose branches bear full, uncensored phalluses, some plucked lovingly, others tossed in baskets, occasionally fought over by nuns with sticks. You sit on a stone bench beside the imaginary garden and flip through an illuminated manuscript, soft pages glowing with shell gold. And there it is, folio 198, a nun carefully harvesting from a tree of virility, while another scowls jealously behind her. Who drew this? Why, no one knows for sure. But it's not the only one. There are dozens of surviving examples. Mainstream historical fact: late medieval Europe was obsessed with symbolism, and plants were often coded with meanings chastity, fertility, sin. But penis trees, they show up primarily in 13th to 15th century manuscripts from France and Italy, often scribbled into the margins by monks and artists who'd probably spent way too long indoors. Scholars still argue whether these images were jokes, satire, erotic fantasy, or some chaotic blend of all three. One theory holds that they mocked clerical lust, turning male desire into literal fruit ripe for picking. Another suggests they were darkly humorous responses to fears about infertility or spiritual corruption. Or maybe they were just bored artists getting spicy on the job. Marginalia, after all, was a lawless zone. Here's your quirky tidbit. One manuscript from Tuscany features a woman riding a giant chicken while brandishing two disembodied phalluses like batons. She's chasing a man who's weeping into a helmet. No context. Just vibes. You stroll further into the garden and things get weirder. A nearby bush is decorated with wax votives in the shape of genitals, ears, and eyes. These were offerings. Medieval people would buy body part-shaped wax figures to pray for healing or improvement. You pass a candle shaped like a buttock, another like a breast, and one shaped like a well-endowed mushroom. Tasteful. In certain shrines, these votive offerings were hung from trees like Christmas ornaments of suppressed frustration. The implication: a plea to the divine: fix this part of me. Make it work. Make it desirable. Make it fertile. The line between humor, hope, and desperation was razor thin. And the penis tree, maybe it was a fantasy of abundance. In a world of strict moral codes where sex was shameful and tightly controlled, the image of too much sex, unlimited access, became comically transgressive. A medieval forbidden fruit, if you will. You reach a fresco, partly faded by rain. It shows a monk reaching for a low-hanging phallus, with an expression of serene enlightenment. You almost expect him to say, "Ah yes, the fruit of knowledge." Honestly, it fits. Nearby, carved into the stone wall, is a more disturbing image. A woman is being punished for plucking from the tree, dragged away by devils with goat legs and curling tongues. Some believed women's desire was demonic in origin, that too much lust could summon literal monsters. And what better metaphor than a tree bearing exactly what the Church said should never be freely given, and yet the trees persist. They appear in the margins of medical texts, on the ceilings of taverns, even once in a cathedral's stone corbel just above eye level where only the most curious would spot it. One surviving poem reads, "In orchard deep where silence grows, a fruit most rare in shadow shows, not apple pear nor fig divine, but that which men and monks entwine." You chuckle. Medieval poets really didn't know how to chill. You brush your fingers across one last carving before leaving. It's crude and simple, just a hand reaching up, and another pulling away. No judgment. No explanation. Perhaps that's the most medieval thing of all, a silent acknowledgement that desire, like art, sometimes makes no sense at all. You make your way from the surreal orchard of virility and wander into the outskirts of a sprawling medieval city, a place where alleyways snake like veins, and every fifth window hosts someone whispering something scandalous behind a curtain. You've arrived at one of the oldest institutions in the world, the brothel. But this isn't some shadowy den of shame. No, in many parts of medieval Europe, prostitution was legalized, taxed, and brace yourself, sometimes encouraged by the very people who were supposed to preach chastity. Welcome to the city-sanctioned house of sin, where the rules were written in Latin, but the business ran on moaning and coin. You pass under an archway bearing the image of Saint Mary Magdalene, patroness of fallen women, repentant sinners, and apparently this entire neighborhood. In cities like Paris, London, and Florence, designated red light districts were set aside for sex workers. Some even bore sweet names like Rue des Filles Dieu Street of the Daughters of God. Nice try, Town Council. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the 14th century, many European municipalities had legalized prostitution as a necessary evil. The logic went like this: if men didn't have a legal regulated outlet for lust, they'd commit worse sins like seducing married women, raping virgins, or, God forbid, self-pleasuring. Clutch your pearls. Cities collected taxes from brothels. Prostitutes were inspected for cleanliness. Houses were supposed to close on holy days and provide lanterns after dark. In return, workers gained a degree of protection, though protection is doing a lot of work here. You slip into one of the brothels through a back door. The scent of rose oil clings to the walls and laughter floats through silk partitions. A lute plays in the next room. It's shockingly civilized. A woman offers you a cup of watered wine and a seat beside the hearth. Her name is Mathilde, and she's been working here for 6 years. She explains that many of her clients are priests. They pay better, she says, sipping, and they cry less. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some brothels, women were required by law to wear blue dresses to mark their trade, but only inside the brothel. Outside, they could wear whatever they liked. This led to some inventive fashion quick changes and a booming trade in reversible cloaks. But not all was rosy in the rose-colored rooms. Though technically legal prostitutes were barred from owning property, marrying citizens, or testifying in court. In many cities, they could be publicly flogged for leaving their district, and their brothels often owned by the town itself. That's right, medieval city councils ran side hustles in sex work. Efficient governance. In Florence, one document outlines regulations for a state-owned brothel, no more than 1 woman per bed. All windows must have shutters. No clients of the same blood may enter together. You nod. So, no incest, no orgies, and definitely no peeking. Still, historians argue whether legalization actually protected women or just made it easier to control and exploit them. Many women ended up in brothels after being orphaned, exiled, or falsely accused of other crimes. Others were trafficked across borders by corrupt clergy or wealthy merchants. As you walk through the upper floor, you hear a woman reading aloud. It's a romance tale, Tristan and Isolde, and she's surrounded by three others sewing lace and giggling. Brothels often doubled as informal literacy hubs. If you wanted to learn letters math or how to mix a better herbal contraceptive, this was the place. Matilda tells you she can calculate interest rates faster than the local banker. You descend into the basement where the real weirdness begins. A locked cabinet contains carved wooden phalluses, some ornate, some terrifying. One has a Latin phrase, tempus fugit virilitas manet. Time flies, virility stays. Another is shaped like a bishop's crozier. You raise your eyebrows. Matilda shrugs. Commissioned, never collected. There's also a small soot-blackened chapel, yes, inside the brothel. Some workers would pray before and after each client. Not necessarily for forgiveness, but for protection. Sex and faith weren't enemies here. They were roommates with a tense relationship and a shared rent bill. You spot an old ledger tucked behind a loose stone. The entries include names, payments, and bizarre requests. One man weekly pays triple for silence and warm socks. Another requests only to be insulted in German. History, it turns out, is deeply, hilariously human. And for all its business-like structure, the medieval brothel was still a site of risk. Disease, violence, and public disgrace loomed constantly. But in a world where women had few paths to autonomy, some made a living here on their own terms. Matilda walks you to the door as dawn breaks. She hands you a ribbon blue on one side, black on the other. To remember us, she says. Flip it depending on what kind of day you're having. You nod. Because in this strange, contradictory world, even the darkest places had their own odd flicker of dignity. It's well past dawn, when you find yourself ambling along a muddy rural path, miles from the noise and perfume of the brothel district. Chickens scatter at your feet. A donkey eyes you like you've personally insulted his ancestors. And somewhere just over the hill, you hear a woman screaming. Not in pain, in rage. You crest the slope and find a crowd gathered around two people locked in the most medieval form of public therapy imaginable, a marriage duel. Yes, sometimes when a husband and wife had a disagreement too explosive for the confessional or the dinner table, they didn't just argue. They fought. With rules. In front of the whole village. You blink. The woman stands in a ditch wielding a rock wrapped in cloth. The man stands above her on a wooden platform, his right arm tied behind his back. Everyone is very into this. You're not dreaming. This was a thing. Mainstream historical fact in 13th and 14th century Germany. Judicial duels between married couples were occasionally permitted to resolve accusations of abuse, infidelity, or impotence. The setups were intentionally absurd. The woman would be given a weighted weapon and a physical advantage like standing in a hole while the man was often hobbled or partially disarmed. The idea to simulate equality, which of course is medieval legal code for we made it weird on purpose. The woman lunges and the crowd cheers. The man slips. He's not bleeding, but his pride definitely bruised. Historians still argue whether these duels were symbolic rituals meant to shame one party into backing down, or actual legal processes with real consequences. Some records say the loser forfeited property or custody. Others suggest they were forced into exile or servitude. One story tells of a husband who lost, was beaten unconscious, and had to spend a year as his wife's stable boy. Honestly, sounds fair. You shift among the villagers. Someone offers you a meat pie. You accept because nothing says spousal combat like baked goods. Here's your quirky tidbit. One rare manuscript shows the woman wielding a sack filled with rocks, and the man defending himself with a wooden spoon. The image is delicately labeled Duel for Domestic Disobedience, 1450. Even the artist added tiny musical notes in the margins, possibly indicating that some of these duels were accompanied by a band. You move closer and overhear the argument that sparked this one. Apparently, the wife accused her husband of letting the candle burn too long while she bled, which may sound poetic until you realize it was probably about contraception or lack thereof. In the absence of reliable birth control, timing, ritual, and trust were everything. Ah, yes, contraception. You head toward the village bathhouse where you find an old woman selling bundles of herbs tied with red string. She calls them moonroot charms, and they're supposed to soften the womb. Others swear by sheep bladder pouches, beeswax plugs, or brace yourself papyrus soaked in vinegar. Some women used mixtures of pennyroyal and rue, both believed to discourage conception. Were they effective? Not always. Were they dangerous? Absolutely. But when the alternative was another child or 10, risk often came second to autonomy. You pass a girl who whispers a rhyme under her breath before swallowing something wrapped in a fig leaf. You don't ask. The folk methods were many and almost all shrouded in secrecy. After all, talking openly about contraception could land you in front of the church authorities, or worse, your mother-in-law. Still, midwives and village-wise women passed this knowledge down quietly, generation to generation. It was a silent rebellion rooted in bodies rather than books, and of course the church hated it. Clerical writers describe these practices as sinful, unnatural, or even demonic. One 14th century bishop wrote, "She who denies her womb denies God." That bishop, it's worth noting, never had to give birth in a pigsty during winter. You return to the duel site. The wife has won. Her husband is kneeling muddy and humiliated. The crowd claps politely, and she walks off with what appears to be a chunk of cheese and full custody of the oxen. Justice medieval style. You watch her disappear down the road, ribbon fluttering behind her rock still in hand. She doesn't look back. Because in a world where the law was written by men and enforced by clergy, sometimes a woman had to pick up a sack of stones to be heard. The road from the village duel winds deep into the forest, where the canopy above thickens, and the air smells like wet moss and secrets. You follow an old trail marked by stones and faded carvings, symbols you can't quite decipher, but that feel earthy, ancient. And soon you come upon a clearing that smells of firewood, sweat, and something sharp and bitter like old iron. In the center is a ring of dancers barefoot and chanting in a language older than Latin. You've stumbled into what the church would call a lechery circle. But here it's just pagan fertility rites, where sex, the seasons, and the sacred were never meant to be separate. Let's talk about how people celebrated the human body long before the sermon replaced the song. Because while medieval Christianity fought to smother sensuality under veils and vows, the rural world remembered with bonfires, body paint, and rituals that looked suspiciously like orgies if you squinted. Mainstream, historical fact, pre-Christian festivals like Beltane Imbolc and May Day were fertility celebrations tied to planting cycles, the return of warmth and the renewal of life. Even as the church spread, these festivals lingered, sometimes repackaged as saints' days, but still packed with suspiciously lusty undertones. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some villages, couples would leap over fires naked to ensure strong children. Others performed symbolic plowings of the earth, one person lying down while another mimed sowing the soil. Subtle, not exactly. You edge closer to the ritual. A man and woman stand at the center, arms painted in spirals, their bodies dusted with flour and ash. They exchange garlands of herbs, press foreheads together, then begin a slow, spiraling dance. It's less erotic and more cosmic, like they're syncing themselves to something deeper than biology. But don't be fooled. These weren't just abstract symbols. In many communities, fertility rites included actual sexual unions, sometimes sacred, sometimes simply festive. One Germanic festival allowed greenwood marriages, temporary bonds formed for a single night of passion beneath the trees. If a child resulted, the community helped raise it, a kind of sanctioned wild fling. And yes, this horrified the church. By the 13th century, bishops were issuing sermons warning against devilish frolicking on Midsummer's Eve. One particularly panicked monk wrote that Satan enters the womb through laughter and dance, which kind of makes you want to dance just out of spite. Historians still argue whether the orgiastic image of pagan festivals is exaggerated, a smear campaign by anxious priests, or if rural folks really were getting it on under every oak tree. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle, a mix of ritual community bonding and the very natural human desire to celebrate being alive in the brief window between plagues. One faded folktale tells of the Moon Maiden, who appears once a year to bless couples with fertility if they can find her clearing and dance until sunrise. Some say she was once a goddess. Others say she was just a wise woman who knew the secrets of the body and refused to bow to the bishop. You spot an older woman stirring a pot over a fire. She offers you a drink, thick, dark, and spiced with something numbing. For openness, she says with a wink. The others laugh. Someone starts a drum beat, and as the rhythm builds, the dance changes. It gets faster. Bodies sway closer. Some kiss. Others shed layers of cloth like leaves. But nothing feels forced or chaotic. It's deliberate. Devotional. Like the forest is part of it too, leaning in. You sit quietly at the edge and watch. For a moment you imagine a world where the body wasn't a battlefield, where desire wasn't shameful but seasonal, celebrated, honored like the harvest. But here's the reality: most of these traditions didn't survive. The church eventually absorbed or outlawed them. Participants were accused of witchcraft, lasciviousness, or worse. Trees were chopped down. Drums were silenced. Silence was called virtue. And yet some things slipped through. Maypoles, harvest feasts, midsummer's night songs that no one admits are about sex. Because even in the most repressed centuries, the body has a way of remembering. The fire crackles. The dancers slow. A child hands you a flower crown with a shy smile. You place it on your head. It smells of thyme and sweat and damp bark. And as you rise and continue on your journey, you don't look back. Because part of you now carries the rhythm. And part of you knows in the deep woods of medieval life, some joy refused to be erased. You're walking again, this time through the tight, twisting streets of a medieval university town. The buildings are hunched together like gossiping old men, every window dripping with ivy or laundry. Students rush past in robes far too clean for the real world, quoting Aristotle in Latin, while secretly hoping someone is watching them be intellectual. But you're not here for lectures. You duck into a small stone building nestled between a parchment cellar and a man advertising goose massages. Don't ask. Inside, it smells like ink wax and curiosity. You've just stepped into the world of medieval sex education, where the first anatomy lessons were delivered with straight faces and barely concealed giggles. Mainstream historical fact: by the 12th and 13th centuries, European universities were translating ancient Greek and Arabic texts on medicine, anatomy, and reproduction. Think Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna, big names in old science. These texts were studied seriously, but when it came to sex, even the scholars couldn't resist letting things get weird. A professor enters, nods to his handful of students, and rolls out a parchment labeled De Secretis Mulierum, The Secrets of Women. It was a popular treatise believed to have been written by Albertus Magnus, though he probably didn't filled with helpful gems like women are colder than men. The womb has 7 chambers. Too much melancholy can make your baby sad forever. You stifle a laugh. The professor points to a woodcut of a naked man labeled meticulously Testiculus virga vesica. It's genuinely educational until someone in the back loudly asks if the virga grows longer with prayer. No one answers. Here's your quirky tidbit: some medieval anatomy drawings show the uterus as a little pot with doors, or like a cow's stomach with multiple compartments. One even has a tiny person inside, sitting politely with crossed legs. Apparently, wombs had waiting rooms. But things get truly spicy when the class moves to the Book of Generation. It describes the seed of man as fiery, active, noble. Woman's contribution: moist, passive, receptive. Unsurprisingly, this led to the conclusion that male pleasure was essential for conception, but female pleasure optional. Biologically nice, but morally suspicious. You eavesdrop on a student debate. One insists that loud moaning during sex proves women feel lust and must therefore be watched. Another counters that such sounds are the devil's echo and chastity silences the flesh. A third student just wants to go home. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly believed all of this or just repeated it because it was in Latin and written by people with cool robes. Some of it, like the wandering womb theory. Yes, wombs were thought to float around the body like lost balloons, was taken very seriously. Other ideas, like semen needing to be stored in the brain, may have caused even medieval minds to raise an eyebrow. You wander deeper into the archives where forbidden books are kept. One wrapped in dark velvet is a 14th century copy of The Mirror of Simple Souls, a mystic text written by a woman who described her union with God using surprisingly physical metaphors. Lines like, "He entered me and I was filled with divine fire," didn't go unnoticed. The church banned it. Naturally, students read it anyway. Another student shows you a private sketchbook. In it are drawings of fantastical creatures, mermaids with exposed breasts, satyrs with enormous appendages, and a rather bold reimagining of the Annunciation involving blush-worthy dialogue. For study, the student insists, of course. And here's where education and fantasy blur. The medieval mind was curious, deeply so. But its access to information was filtered through layers of fear morality and heavy-handed theology. So when young scholars tried to learn about the body desire or reproduction, they often ended up tangled in metaphors about sin and astronomy. You notice a marginal note beside a drawing of a penis labeled Column of Virtue. It reads, "When upright, a sign of God's design." when misused, a ladder to hell. Subtle, in a corner, you find a book on dream interpretation. One entry reads, "To dream of a serpent entering the body is to long for union. If it exits covered in honey, beware betrayal." You close the book slowly. Still, amidst all the nonsense and superstition, something real shines through. People wanted to understand each other, to figure out how life began, to ask why the heart races when fingers brush. It wasn't always accurate, but it was earnest. As the class ends, the professor sighs and assigns everyone a scroll on reproductive humors. Half the students groan. The other half pretend they already read it. You step outside as bells toll in the distance. Pigeons scatter and a group of students bicker about whether lustful thoughts can be transmitted through eye contact. Spoiler, one monk thought yes. You walk away realizing this in a time when most people didn't live past 40. Even a wildly inaccurate diagram was better than nothing. Education, however flawed, was still aflame, and sometimes it flickered in the shape of a curious glance, a strange woodcut, or a whispered joke in the back row. By now, your path has taken you through cities and brothels, fields and forests, into the minds of monks and the rituals of peasants. But tonight, as the moon creeps high over a hushed town, you find yourself somewhere even stranger, between the linen sheets of a medieval marriage bed. And it's crowded, not with people usually, but with ideas, myths, rules, rituals, because despite what romance novels may suggest, sex within medieval marriage was often more awkward than passionate. And navigating, it could feel like a theological obstacle course. You step quietly into a candlelit chamber. A couple sits on the bed looking at each other like they've just been handed a map with no instructions and told, "Figure it out." Their priest stands in the corner trying to look anywhere else. The midwife adjusts a small tapestry that features, no joke, a unicorn gently nudging a virgin. Welcome to wedding night. Mainstream historical fact. The medieval church placed enormous importance on sex within marriage, not just as a spiritual duty, but as a legal one. Sex consummated the union. No consummation, no real marriage. That's why wedding nights sometimes involved witnesses just outside the room, or in rare cases physically present in the chamber to verify completion. Yes, that happened. You glance at the priest's notes. There's a checklist. It includes prayers, confessions, and instructions not to enjoy the act too much, lest it cross into sinful territory. Apparently, it was acceptable to procreate, but God forbid you enjoy the process without a baby on the agenda. Still, historians argue whether these restrictions were truly followed by couples, or if they were mostly preached from pulpits and promptly ignored in bedrooms. Let's talk about the rules. Sex on Sundays forbidden. During Lent, nope. Advent, absolutely not. Feast days. You better feast on restraint. Some historians estimate nearly half the calendar year was considered inappropriate for marital intimacy. And yet, people kept making babies. Suspicious? No. Here's your quirky tidbit. One 13th century manuscript advised couples to avoid conceiving children on Wednesdays because children born of midweek sin are prone to excessive sneezing and cowardice. This was followed without irony by a recipe for strengthening seed that involved boiled parsley and goat bile. Delicious. You examine the marriage bed itself. Sturdy oak-embroidered sheets and sometimes a chastity pillow, a cushion with a hole in the center for extremely duty-focused encounters. Romantic, not exactly. Also, there was something called the marriage debt. This wasn't financial, it was sexual obligation. Both spouses were required to provide intimacy upon request. Denying your partner could be grounds for annulment. But, and here's the twist, it went both ways. Wives could demand the debt too, and in some rare but glorious legal cases, husbands were fined for being unwilling or unable. You walk through a hallway lined with family portraits. Behind each smiling couple lies a tapestry of unspoken truths that desire didn't always align with duty, that love wasn't guaranteed, that many marriages were arranged for land or alliances, and figuring out the physical part came second to keeping up appearances. And yet there was tenderness. In one letter from a 14th century English merchant to his wife, he writes, "Though I must be in Bruges for trade, I ache for your touch and dream of your laughter upon my skin." Not exactly Chaucer, but it's real, intimate, personal. Love existed in these unions even when it wasn't required. You pass a bundle of herbs tied near the bedpost, sage, mugwort, and yarrow, meant to calm the humors and sweeten the night. There's also a small wooden figurine shaped like a frog. You ask the midwife. She winks. "For fertility," she whispers. You don't ask further. In wealthier homes, the marital bed could become a political statement. Some noble couples commissioned illustrated manuals showing various permitted positions based allegedly on scripture. One French nobleman had a bed carved with scenes from Genesis, Adam and Eve, under a fig tree bashfully glancing at each other, like they just invented spooning. But in humbler homes, things were simpler. A bed, a blanket, maybe a prayer, and a lot of improvisation. Of course, not all was gentle. Marital rape wasn't recognized as a crime. Consent was assumed by the very nature of marriage. Many women had no say. Some men too. And behind every romantic tale, there's the shadow of duty twisted into control. Still, you find yourself lingering in this quiet space. Because despite the awkwardness, the absurd rules, the doctrinal pressure, there was still something human here. Two people fumbling toward connection, sometimes failing, sometimes laughing, occasionally lighting a candle and trying again. You glance at a side table where a small book lies open. The final line reads, "And though we are bound by vow and veil, let us meet not as sinners, but as souls with skin." You step back into the hallway as the door quietly closes behind you. The candle flickers once, then steadies, because even in a time of repression, fear, and control, there were still nights when two people simply held each other, not to make heirs, not to fulfill doctrine, but just to be warm, to be human. You leave behind the quiet hush of the marriage chamber, your feet echoing softly through the stone hallways of a grand manor. But as the walls begin to close in with stiff portraits and judgmental tapestries, you slip out a side door and find yourself in the courtyard. And there, beneath the grapevines and moonlight, you hear laughter, female laughter, the kind that makes you want to eavesdrop. You follow the sound to a garden alcove where four women sit in a circle. Their nobles, lace collars, silk veils, fingers heavy with rings, and they're sharing something no etiquette manual would ever include. Their private fantasies. Welcome to the secret world of female desire. In the Middle Ages, a realm you won't find in sermons or scrolls, but that absolutely existed between the lines of letters, poetry, and whispered confession. Mainstream historical fact. Contrary to popular myth, medieval women were not emotionless vessels of piety and passivity. Many wrote about love lust and longing in ways that were bold, playful, and sometimes even scandalous. From courtly ladies to cloistered nuns, female desire didn't just exist, it insisted. One woman recites a poem she's memorized not to impress a man, but to entertain her friends. It's from Marie de France, a 12th century poetess, whose verses are full of clever, passionate heroines, who choose their lovers and sneak out windows without shame. He pressed his hand upon her heart. She turned away and blushed in part. But when the moon behind clouds fell, she whispered things she'd never tell. The others swoon. One fans herself dramatically with a plum branch. Here's your quirky tidbit. In 14th century Italy, a noblewoman named Trotula of Salerno wrote medical texts specifically about female pleasure, explaining in detail that women could feel joy from intimacy and that a cold womb makes for a cold heart. Her works were so revolutionary, they were sometimes falsely attributed to male doctors, because obviously a woman couldn't know that much about herself. You sit nearby on a marble bench as the women trade gossip about that one knight who only talks about fasting, but blushes when someone mentions saddles. One woman reveals she once dreamt of kissing a man dressed as a bishop. Another confesses that she reads the Song of Songs not for theology, but for the juicy metaphors. His fruit was sweet to my taste, she quotes, and I sat in his shadow with great delight. A moment of scandalized silence, and then laughter. Historians still argue whether these expressions of desire were common or confined to elite women with access to books and privacy. But evidence suggests that even peasant girls composed songs and riddles about sex, some of them still preserved in folk collections. One popular tune from the 13th century compares a lover to a wild fox who sneaks in at night and leaves muddy footprints on the floor. You smile. Some things really don't change. You lean closer as the ladies pull out small painted tokens, symbols of secret flirtations. A rose pressed into wax. A carved bone charm. One woman shows off a letter folded so many times it's become a square no larger than a coin. It's from a poet who writes her verse in Latin and swears eternal devotion despite being married to someone else. Of course. And then comes the real shocker. One woman, a widow with silver hair, produces a tiny carved box. Inside is a miniature sculpture, a naked couple in a most non-liturgical pose. She smirks. A French import, she says. They all lean in. One jokes I'd like that pose explained, slowly. Another says, try it on horseback. And the oldest of them waves a dismissive hand and says, just make sure he doesn't fall asleep afterward. That's when they stop being poetry and start being potatoes. You sit there in the moonlight, surrounded by a kind of radical honesty that could never have been spoken aloud in the daylight. Because in this hidden garden of noble women and mischief, desire isn't something to deny. It's something to own. And maybe that's what scares the outside world the most. Because when women speak about their bodies, their wants, their hunger, they take power. Not by rebellion, not by protest, but by naming what they feel without shame. The wind stirs the ivy above, and the laughter quiets. One of the women begins humming a tune, a lullaby from her youth. You recognize it was once used to soothe babies to sleep, but here it's repurposed as a hymn to female solidarity. Soft, sacred, unapologetically intimate. They gather their things and vanish down separate corridors like shadows in silk, and you're left in this garden with the scent of jasmine, a heart full of secrets, and the unshakable feeling that in a world designed to silence women, the most radical act of all was talking. From moonlit gardens and whispered confessions, you wander toward the outskirts of town again, where the fires burn lower and the air hangs heavier. This isn't the warmth of candlelight or the glow of quiet intimacy. This is something more chaotic, messy, almost theatrical. You've arrived at a festival, but not the wholesome kind with pie contests and ribbon dancers. No, this is the Feast of Fools, where rules unravel, identities blur, and sexual chaos briefly reigns in the name of sacred mockery. You push through a noisy square packed with people dressed like everything and nothing at once. Monks in feathered masks, nuns with donkey ears, beggars dressed as bishops, and at the center of it all, a man wearing a mitre made entirely out of sausages. You don't ask. Mainstream historical fact. The Feast of Fools was a real medieval celebration, especially popular in 12th to 15th century France and parts of Germany. Originally a clerical festival designed to let lower-ranking clergy blow off steam after Christmas, it quickly evolved into the single weirdest thing the church ever tolerated. On this one day, the choir boys elected their own bishop of fools. He might deliver a sermon of gibberish dance in the sanctuary or toss dung at statues of saints. Church services were parodied, sometimes involving flatulence boos or fake exorcisms performed on each other's behinds. Theology optional, and under all the holy mockery was sex. You stumble into an alley where a nun, you're 95% sure it's a butcher's son in drag, is flirting outrageously with a priest who keeps dropping coins down her front. They giggle and run off together, pursued by a goat wearing a crown. Again, you don't ask. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some records show that during these festivals, people wore animal masks and mimicked mating behaviors in public as satire, or sometimes not satire at all. One witness described a troop of fools who crawled on all fours, sniffed each other's behinds, then took communion. And the church, it tried to stop it. Repeatedly. Condemnations flew from bishops' pens like arrows. An abomination in God's house, cried one. Another warned that the devil dances in such jesting. And yet, the festivals returned year after year, often inside church walls. Because even bishops, it turns out, liked to party once a year. Historians still argue whether the Feast of Fools was about venting religious frustration, offering the poor a voice through parody, or simply letting society exhale its collective repression. Some see it as revolutionary. Others say it was just institutionalized mischief. But one thing's certain, for 24 chaotic hours, everything flipped. The humble were exalted. The powerful were mocked. The sacred was profaned. And the line between celebration and sin was deliberately erased. You wander into a makeshift tavern tent where a man dressed as a pig delivers a love sonnet to a woman wearing nothing but a painted-on robe and a crown of leeks. He rhymes temptation with salivation and ends with a burp. The crowd erupts in cheers. Someone pulls you into a dance. It's clumsy, full of bumping hips, grabbed hands, and shouted nonsense lyrics. You laugh despite yourself. Because here's the deeper truth: in a world wound tight with rules, punishments, and moral pressure, chaos could feel like relief. The eroticism wasn't always about lust. Sometimes it was about release, permission. For one night, people could be bawdy, foolish, flirtatious, without fear of hell or judgment. And beneath the masks, there was honesty. Lovers who couldn't show affection in daylight. Wives who mocked their husbands through parody. priests who privately questioned doctrine but publicly danced like donkeys. The absurdity wasn't nonsense. It was survival. The sun begins to rise. Costumes are removed. Roles are reclaimed. The mitre of sausages is quietly eaten by a passing dog. You spot the nun again now in plain clothes hugging someone tightly before slipping into the shadows. And just like that, it's over. Order returns, but the memory lingers. Because if the rest of the year demanded purity, self-denial, and virtue, this was the pressure valve. A yearly exhale. A reminder that even the most pious need to feel silly, sexy, and slightly sacrilegious now and then. As you leave the square, you notice a message carved into a low stone wall. It reads, "For one day I was the Pope. For one night I kissed whom I chose, and no angel stopped me." You smile, because even in the darkest centuries, some souls still danced beneath cathedral arches wearing nothing but wine and nerve. As the last echoes of the Feast of Fools fade behind you, you find yourself wandering into quieter territory. The ground softens beneath your feet. Trees return to line the path. The wind hushes, as if the world itself is beginning to exhale. And finally, you arrive at the one place that medieval society both feared and couldn't stop talking about: the convent. A sanctuary, a prison, a library of souls. In truth, it was all of these. But tonight, we're slipping behind the stone walls to explore something even more cloistered than the cloister itself: forbidden love among nuns. Mainstream historical fact. In medieval Europe, thousands of women entered convents not always by choice. For many noble families, daughters too expensive to marry off were given to God, which functionally meant given to silence, prayer, and celibacy. At least in theory, you step through a quiet chapel bathed in candlelight. Rows of women kneel in silent prayer, their hands folded, faces soft. A hymn rises gently through the air, pure, perfect, like it's untouched by anything of this earth. But just beyond the chapel, past the garden, and into the dormitories, a different world stirs. You find Sister Beatrice and Sister Elodia in the scriptorium pretending to organize hymnals. Their hands touch for a moment too long. One blushes. The other whispers a joke about Saint Agatha's holy bosom, and they both dissolve into stifled giggles. It's not sinful. It's sweet. Here's your quirky tidbit. In the 12th century, a nun named Hildegard of Bingen, yes, the same famous composer and mystic, wrote ecstatic poetry to another nun that described their love as the soul's deepest fire. In one letter, she compares their connection to divine lightning that rends the veil between stars. Subtle, not really. Historians still argue whether these intense relationships were spiritual friendships, romantic partnerships, or discreetly physical affairs. The truth likely varied. But what's undeniable is that many nuns shared bonds that went far beyond prayer circles and needlework. In some convents, love letters were secretly exchanged. Poems tucked inside psalters. One surviving Latin note reads, "I wait for you after matins. Your eyes are holier than relics." Even in highly regulated orders, rumors swirled. Some abbesses were accused of maintaining sisterly favoritism. One Italian bishop furiously reported that a convent in Tuscany had turned into a theater of Sodom, where nuns held hands beneath altar cloths and whispered forbidden sweetness during meals. You find a garden gate slightly ajar. Inside, two figures sit beneath an olive tree. One sings quietly, while the other braids her hair. Their robes brush together in the moonlight. There's no fear in their eyes, just something soft, earnest, old as love itself. But don't mistake convents for paradise. They were places of control, obedience, and often grief. Women who refused marriage or whose dowries were too small were placed here like puzzle pieces no one could figure out where to fit. Their voices in many cases were never recorded, and yet they still found ways to speak through music, through illuminated manuscripts, through gardens of medicinal herbs, each with meanings only they knew. Rue for regret, yarrow for courage, violets for love that couldn't be spoken aloud. You pass by a small library where a novice is reading a copy of The Romance of the Rose, technically forbidden. Yet here it is, annotated in a delicate hand. In the margins beside a steamy passage, someone has written, "Better than sermons." A nun walks past you and slips a tiny folded square of linen into another's sleeve. They never make eye contact. But as they part, both smile just barely. Because even in a world designed to police every thought, gesture, and glance, the human heart made space for connection, for tenderness, for desire cloaked in ritual. And here's the kicker: some of the most passionate medieval writings about love and longing weren't penned by troubadours or knights, but by nuns. Hidden in convent libraries are verses that speak of mouths that burn, eyes that tremble, and souls that ache for another. They weren't just writing about God, or maybe they were. After all, who gets to say which kind of love is divine? As dawn begins to brush the horizon, you stand at the edge of the convent wall and look back. The chapel bells begin to toll. Somewhere a sister is quietly folding a love note into her breviary. Another gently places a hand on her friend's back before disappearing into the choir. The world outside will never know. But inside, where ink meets parchment and hand meets hand in passing, it's written. And in that writing, a quiet kind of rebellion glows, tender, holy, and defiantly human. Word count 198. Wind down, final 300 words. And now, as our journey through medieval desire softens into silence, let your body begin to relax. The torches have been snuffed. The feast has ended. The whispers behind tapestries have faded. And even the moon seems to dim her silver gaze. Let your breath slow. Feel the weight of centuries lifting gently from your shoulders, like a velvet cloak falling away after a long, strange masquerade. You've wandered roads walked by monks in denial and midwives with secrets. You've sat beside noble women trading fantasies under starlight, and stood in forests where rituals hummed beneath the moss. You've heard laughter in cathedrals and seen love scribbled in the margins of ancient books. And yes, you've seen absurdity too, dueling spouses, sausage hats, and floating wombs. But that's what makes history so heartbreakingly human. We try to control the body, to shame it, to elevate it. But underneath all the rules and rituals, we crave connection, longing, touch. Even in times that claim to forbid it, the hunger always found a way to survive in gardens, in poems, in moments stolen from time. So tonight, let that truth settle over you like a quilt. You are part of a very old story, a story of longing wrapped in lace and contradiction, of bodies and boundaries, of joy, shame, play, and resistance. Close your eyes now. Let your own story drift quietly into sleep. Because if medieval history has taught you anything, it's this: desire may bend, but it never breaks. Word count 1094 plus 300 1394. End of script. Sweet dreams.